The first country to liberate women was also the country that continuously exploited them. The Soviet Union proclaimed itself the earliest liberator of women in the world, granting them unprecedented legal rights: the right to vote, equal pay for equal work, access to education, the right to pursue virtually any profession. Shortly after seizing power in 1917, the Bolsheviks issued a series of decrees that were, for their time, genuinely progressive. Women could become engineers, doctors, pilots, even cosmonauts. But if you look closely, beneath this liberation lay another system of strict control. It pulled women out of one traditional cage, only to thrust them into a far more burdensome double role in service of the state. And women's own authentic voices and aspirations were systematically suppressed and dissolved. First, we must understand a fundamental point. Soviet women's emancipation was never a bottom-up movement fought for and won by women themselves. It was not a social transformation driven by decades of street protests, pushed forward by countless women activists who sacrificed their blood and freedom. It was a top-down gift bestowed by the state for the state's own purposes. After seizing power, the Bolsheviks urgently needed to liberate women from the household, not for their self-fulfillment, not for their personal development, but to turn them into factory labor and builders of socialism. Their hands, their bodies, their energy. That was what the state truly needed. Behind this demand lay a stark practical reality. In its early years, the Soviet Union had been ravaged by the First World War, a civil war, and repeated famines. The male labor force had been decimated. By the 1930s, when full-scale industrialization was underway, the labor shortage had reached critical levels. The targets of the first five-year plan were set impossibly high. Stalin demanded that the Soviet Union achieve in a few short years the industrial leap that had taken Western countries decades. What did this mean? It meant the state needed every pair of working hands, regardless of whether those hands belonged to a man or a woman. So you saw women becoming engineers, doctors, tractor drivers, even cosmonauts. Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space in 1963. Her photograph was broadcast around the world as the ultimate symbol of Soviet women's liberation. It looked remarkable. But the state's fundamental purpose was to fill the massive gap left by male workers lost to war and industrial expansion, to meet the ambitious targets of the five-year plans and develop the national economy. It was never about genuine concern for women's individual development. This emancipation was, from the very beginning, deeply colored by pragmatism and state utilitarianism. Women were liberated because the state needed their hands, not because the state had heard their voices. Once women entered the workforce en masse, the real hardship was just beginning. The state encouraged you to work. In fact, it mandated it by law. But what about traditional domestic responsibilities? Cooking, laundry, childcare, serving the husband. None of these went away, and almost all of it remained women's work. The state never made any serious attempt to change this gendered division of labor within the household. It needed women to go to the factories, but it also needed women to continue performing all the unpaid reproductive labor at home. The Soviet Union suffered from chronic and severe shortages of consumer goods. Shopping for groceries could mean queuing for hours. An ordinary Soviet housewife spent an average of over 2 hours every day just standing in lines and procuring basic necessities, time spent on top of an 8-hour work shift. Without modern household appliances, washing machines, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners were either scarce or of abysmal quality in the USSR, domestic labor remained crushingly heavy. This meant a Soviet woman was effectively working 2 full-time jobs. One in the factory or office, generating value for the state, and another at home, maintaining the basic functioning of the entire family. They endured enormous physical and psychological pressure. They had no time that truly belonged to themselves. Their exhaustion, their anxiety, their lives squeezed to the breaking point. Society and the state remained blind to all of it, treating it as perfectly natural. So-called liberation had here become a stark, unvarnished double burden. More crucially, any attempt to challenge this status quo, any independent feminist thought offering a genuinely female perspective, was treated as a dangerous threat. The official line was brutally simple. In the Soviet Union, the woman question had already been completely solved. And if the problem was already solved, then any further discussion was nothing but troublemaking, an attempt to smear socialism, proof that you had been infected by decadent Western capitalist ideas. This logic perfectly silenced everyone. You could not even open your mouth to describe your own suffering, because your suffering, in official discourse, did not exist. Any independent women's organization was strictly prohibited. Any in-depth discussion of gender roles, power structures within the family, sexuality, or reproductive rights was swiftly suppressed. The Soviet Union did not permit feminism. It only permitted the officially approved women's movement. And there is a fundamental difference between the two. The former allows women to define their own demands. The latter has the state define what women should need. In terms of reproductive policy, women's bodies and fertility were to a large extent requisitioned by the state, turned into a resource serving population growth. Under Stalin, in 1936, abortion was strictly banned unless continuing the pregnancy threatened the mother's life. What did this mean? It meant millions of women were forced to give birth to children they did not want and could not afford to raise. Illegal abortions flourished underground, and countless women suffered infection, disability, and death as a result. Divorce was made extremely difficult, with legal procedures deliberately complicated and fees drastically raised. The state needed family stability not out of concern for family happiness, but because the family was the reproductive unit of the labor force. The Heroine Mother Medal was awarded to women who bore 10 or more children. The logic behind all this was stark and clear. The state needed more people, more workers, more soldiers. A woman's womb did not belong to herself. It was an instrument of production for the state. Politically, women were systematically excluded from genuine core power. You could always spot one or two women placed symbolically in the upper echelons, such as Yekaterina Furtseva during the Khrushchev era, who briefly entered the Politburo as the highest-ranking woman of her time. Her photograph appeared in every official newspaper, used to deflect Western questions about Soviet gender equality. Look, we too have women in the highest leadership. But Furtseva was the exception, and her very existence proved the rule. She was assigned to cultural affairs, not heavy industry, defense, or foreign policy, the domains where real power resided. She was a carefully selected and displayed specimen, designed to prove the superiority of the system. The overwhelming majority of female cadres were concentrated in so-called women's fields: education, health, light industry. They served as deputies, handling execution rather than decision-making. They were showpieces in the socialist shop window, carefully selected, carefully displayed, designed to prove to the West and to their own people, look how liberated our women are. But they could never form a political force capable of changing the collective fate of women. Their very presence was meant to demonstrate that women's fate did not need to change. So, the Soviet suppression of women's rights took the form of a sophisticated, systemic hollowing out. It gave women legal equality and the right to work. These were visible achievements that could be proudly displayed, exhibits that could be placed in the socialist shop window for the whole world to see. But it shackled them with a doubled burden and rigid gender roles. It raised high the banner of liberation while strictly forbidding any discussion of women's issues beyond what the state officially permitted. It sent women into the factories but never brought men into the kitchen. It declared the woman question solved and then prohibited anyone from ever asking it again. In the end, what Soviet women obtained was a state-defined, state-exploited emancipation. They became rustless screws in the giant socialist machine, silently enduring double hardship for the grand narrative of the state, unable to utter a unique voice of their own. This emancipation was, in truth, a new form of bondage. It used surface progress to mask deep, structural inequality. And this disguise was harder to detect and harder to break than outright oppression. Because when you tried to point out its existence, someone could point to a piece of legislation and tell you, the problem was solved long ago.